arbiter of truth and morality. So we have this criterion of morality that's independent of social convention, and we actually evaluate society through the lens of that objective criterion of morality. And if society deviates from that criterion, if it's too far away from it, that means that we should actually take the role of activists and change society. So, for instance, why relativism has always failed in my eyes is that it ignores brute phenomenological facts about what it's like to be a conscious creature. For instance, for example, if you were to go back to Nazi Germany, Sam Harris makes a similar point. I like him on morality. I think he's a good writer on this topic. If you were to go back to Nazi Germany, well, obviously, I mean, I suppose some people, let's just presume that, let's suppose certain ethical values. You know what? Not even Nazi Germany. Let's just use an even less contested example. Let's just use ISIS. So if we look at ISIS, we see, I mean, brutal group. We see torturing people en masse, annihilating entire villages, decapitating people en masse, crucifying people, burning them on fire, killing people. These are mostly civilians. So they do all of this to civilians, mass rapes, probably some female genital mutilation, pretty much throw in every brutal behavior that you can imagine into a pot, and that's you have that group. So within those territories that they control, those ideas were hegemonic. They were
Hmm.
sanctioned by the group, but that doesn't necessarily make them true. In fact, and it doesn't mean that people just stopped resisting because they realized,
Doesn't make
oh,
it wrong that most people thought it was
they're
wrong.
socially the dominant. That was actually what fueled activism and resistance. A similar case applies in Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, the Nazis took control of society and they reshaped it so as to promote certain ideas. Perhaps less impactfully because it's not as directly moral. It doesn't as directly relate to suffering. They said that certain types of art are degenerate or and other types of art are Aryan or this is Jewish physics and then this is a different Aryan science that's better and so on and so forth. They had these divisions in the way that they thought about the products of human creativity. And then there was also the Holocaust, there were the racial laws, and even if you're a hardcore NS person, I think most people would probably disagree with at least the idea of the Holocaust, which is to annihilate a certain group of people through violence. I mean, I know you could say it's an uncharitable interpretation. There's some people who deny it happened. I
Well,
think that they're wrong
here's the
about it.
thing.
But the fact, so just because those ideas were socially sanctioned doesn't mean that people just say, oh, okay, yeah, we'll just accept it. That's what morality is now. No, people rebelled. And even within the aesthetic dimension, I want to hear your views on aesthetics as well. People just didn't agree with Nazi aesthetics. I mean, people like Arnold Schoenberg came along and said that, no, I mean, they're just wrong about this. And actually, that's why the Nazis hated Schoenberg and they hated 12-tone music, they hated serial music, they thought it was degenerate. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone just agreed and said, "Oh, I mean, this music is bad." I like a lot of that music. And on the more fundamental scale, because I think morality and aesthetics are almost the same, they're not completely the same, but they're heavily intertwined. You can't really separate them from each other. No, countless people disagree with those policies. That's why there was a resistance in Vichy France, resistance to the occupation. That's why there are partisan guerrillas, and that's why we have movies that glamorize those fighters. Movies like Inglourious Bastards that talk about the forces who tried to annihilate the Nazis. So I don't really see
Yeah.
how even from a practical empirical standpoint, most people act as if what you've said is not true. Most people don't just accept what society tells them, and that's literally why activism even exists. I mean, because if that was the case, Bernie wouldn't even be out there. Most leftist politicians wouldn't be out there. They just, oh, okay, well, society's like this, so that determines morality. No, I think morality comes first. You see what I'm saying? I don't get relativism. I
Yeah,
feel like it makes
well,
no
okay.
sense. Okay. All right. I think I understand what you're saying, but okay, there's a lot I could say about this, but because I think that we miss some of the fundamentals. But what about some of the other examples? Like so you have the policies that preceded the Holocaust, Nazi racial laws, Kristallnacht, deportation of
Yeah.
certain groups, the policies about dividing society into the degenerate and the Aryan, the aesthetic views. What do you think about all of that? Because to most people it seems less high stakes because it doesn't as directly involve questions of suffering, violence. But I think that's actually where people's answers are most revealing. So what about that? I mean, how defensible is
Yeah,
all of it?
I would say most of that, if you think that's going to make the life of the people of the country better, then yeah, you should probably do that.
Okay, but
And the
what if it
opposite is
involves
true. If it was if you Jordan really thought that banning tonal music would increase the quality of life of the average American, then I would say that you should do that. Or that or at least I would say that if I was you and I had your same brain, then that's what I would do.
yeah, well I don't I would never support a policy like that. But
No
we
more
can talk about
bunk.
aesthetics too. No, but okay. Huh. All right. No, but you know what
Walker's
the problem
boring.
is though? Because we arrive at this point because we were talking about morality, what it is, whether or not it exists outside of social convention. And you were saying that you could make an argument for all of these different scenarios being justified, even though it's harder to do that for ISIS. But doesn't that just prove my point? Because you're still falling back on morality. You think this is better than
No.
that.
Well,
I'm just trying to
morality is a
say what I was
thing.
trying to ask you is
Morality
where
is
it
a
comes
thing that we
from.
can comprehend, right? It's a
Yeah.
social construct. So,
But can it still be objective though? I
no,
mean, how is it
because
not objective though?
because
If it's see,
if I'm
bro, we just
ISIS and you're not ISIS, then who's in if ISIS is true to me and ISIS is not true to you, then who's right?
what do you mean if ISIS is true?
If
Like
ISIS's
if the
ideology
ideas
is
are
true.
if the ideology is also good in a sense, it's correct, good.
Yeah.
Okay. And if re trying to realize that ideology in the real world through the methods that they used is good. So let's you
Yeah.
have someone who thinks that it's good, basically. So an
Hmm.
actual jihadist. So you're saying
Yeah.
you have a jihadist and someone who's not a jihadist.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, again, the entire idea behind moral objectivism is that we can have external arbiters who realize that one is better than the other because that's just how we move through life. I mean, so
Hmm.
do you think the entirety of the fact that conflict exists in society and has for a very long time means that we should just be in a deadlock all the time? We should never move forward. So, for instance, you have people who think that we should abolish ICE, and then people who think that ICE should actually stay. So what
Yeah.
happens if what you're saying is true? We just don't really do anything. We just sit down, let them kill each other, or do we see which one's right
No,
and try
well,
to? I don't
well,
get
what we
it.
do, what
Practically,
we
what
do
does this mean
is
on a practical level?
okay. So if I'm a jihadist and you're a jihadist, here's the thing. I'm going to try to achieve jihad. You're trying to avoid jihad and trying to stop me from being a jihadist, right? Fundamentally, material things are the only things that we can determine I mean, like things that happened in terms of material are the only things that we can determine epistemologically, right? And those things have no bearing, I think, on what is good or what is bad. There's no way you can determine that, right?
No, see, I think
So,
that's where this messes up. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, I think
okay.
that's where it feels.
So do you think so how does that manifest materially? How do things that are good or bad manifest
Okay,
materially? Like the
earlier I was
hormones
going
in
to
people's
reference
brains.
a book that I really like. There's an author nowadays who I think is great about this. He was also a member of the New Atheists. And I was going to bring up the New Atheists as well because I used to be a diehard member of that entire intellectual sect. And I thought that they were completely right about religion being this organized religion being a source of great evil in society. My views have actually changed quite significantly. They've matured. What I think about God, theology has changed over time, his existence, and so on and so forth. But I think the fundamental impulse to use reason to better the world and to better our state is actually correct and it's valuable. So what I'd say is when if you read Sam Harris, he has a book that I love. It's called The Moral Landscape because he how science can determine human values. And he was
Hmm.
saying that first of all, this topic is supremely important for him. I think he's right to regard it as maximally important because it's fundamental. It underlies everything that we do. And so he's decided to approach it in the most logically rigorous manner. And in that book, he says for centuries and centuries, we've been debating moral questions. Pretty much everything that we debate about is a moral question. When we're in politics and we're deciding as to which policy we should pass, which candidate's better than the other, we're talking about a moral question. When we're in the world of art and aesthetics, when we're talking about which one is better than the other, if we based on some form of pleasure or goodness, again, we're just falling back on morality. So it always goes back to morality, which means he says that means that you have to dissect it like a logician and think about it as surgically as possible. And he says the greatest source of confusion that's plagued moral thought and thinking about morality for so long is the idea that you can never arrive at, be it as a result of metaphysical limitations or some other problem, maybe an inbuilt cognitive limitation that we humans suffer from. You can never arrive at facts about morality through either observations of the world or through logical reasoning. And he said in that book, which I agree with. I mean, I have my own stance that I fleshed out over years, but I think he provides the skeleton argument very nicely. He says that no, he thinks that moral statements are actually facts. They're not just short-term feelings. They're not just expressions of emotion. So he's not an emotivist. He says they're facts and the facts actually are based on phenomena that are happening in the world around us. So what he does is he says, okay, moral claims are facts about the well-being of conscious, or no, he says sentient beings, sentient creatures in the world. And because we know with a very high degree of certainty that has been is based on observations that have been verified time and time again over the course of life, because we know what tends to bring about well-being as well as the antithesis of well-being, we can actually use basically scientific thinking, observations of the world around us, to objectively determine what's better than something else and what's good and what's bad. Because they all go back to claims about the well-being of conscious beings. And so if you can look at what impacts the well-being of a conscious being, which is why he thinks vegetarianism could be valuable as well, you can determine as to what it is, okay, what is it that produces negative experiences, or that a lack of well-being, what it is that produces well-being. We should probably prefer the latter over the former. And that's why I think he says that it's the most elegant solution to all of these problems, and it's not really as complicated as people make it out to be. So he thinks that you can actually arrive at it through logical thinking and through observations of the world around us. I think he's basically right about that. I mean, you should check out that book, The Moral Landscape. I think it's really smart.
I mean, I'll check it out, but my question is,
Yeah.
why does basically, why does the well-being of something
Oh,
determine if it's good or bad?
because he thinks that those terms have no meaning outside of the. I mean, he should have responded to this more
Yeah, I
clearly.
don't think
All
good
that he
and
says
bad
is
are a thing.
all he says is that the question itself is somewhat misleading. But what I would say is, okay, you can't define those terms in terms that are simpler than themselves. And this actually relates to the most fundamental question of metaphysics that could even exist. It relates to questions about God and theology, which is like, okay, what's actually out there and what's most fundamental in existence. And I'd say that whenever you talk about, for instance, okay, you say 1 + 1 = 2. Well, why is that the case? How is that the case? Why doesn't it equal 3? And so on and so forth. And then you would answer that by saying, okay, well, 1 is equal to itself. So if I add an entity that's equal to itself, I have two entities. So
Yeah.
that's a logicist approach. But then from there, and that's what logicians in the 20th century tried to do, like Bertrand Russell, Whitehead, that's what they were obsessed with. Frege, all of these people, major term in philosophy of math. But then someone asked me, okay, how do you know that 1 is equal to itself? How do I know that A is equal to itself, that A equals A and doesn't equal B, or that any entity is equal to itself? You say, okay, well, at that point, the why question is just brushing up against meta logic. That's just the way that it is. It's a precondition, it's a fact that we have to accept. Do you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't really make
Yeah.
sense to question it. It's a transcendental. And then some people would say that's actually a proof of God, because they'd say God is actually the ground of those transcendent facts, like the laws of logic, math, and so on and so forth. So we can say that they hold true
Wow.
in part because they're reflecting a deeper meta level truth. And so when it comes to morality, you can't really question. You have to presuppose it. It's the base upon which everything stands. So there's a paradox called the problem of infinite regress, and it's connected to all of this: morality, logic, epistemology, math, everything. So basically, how it goes is, so someone tells someone else to do something or that they shouldn't do something. That person asks them why, and then they say, okay, because of X reason. Then someone says why X, and then they say because of Y, and then so on and so forth until you have an infinite regress. So the paradox is, okay, how can we be sure as to the reason for anything in life, as to why we should do anything, if you can never actually answer on a fundamental level, because each justification can be countered by an additional question. And so what I say is, rather than being the death sentence of thought, that just means that there's this fundamental groundwork level of being that underlies everything that we have to presuppose and take as a given. That's it. And so when you ask, oh, why does well-being determine good and bad? Because we know that it feels good to feel good and it feels bad to feel bad. And those are just the fundamental facts. I mean, you could say that it's circular, but I would say it's actually above the circular. It's more fundamental than everything else. It's a transcendental. Those are the transcendentals. And
Mhm. Well,
that's exactly what Plato talked about. He said if you group them all together, you have the theory of the realm of forms. And I'm not really a Platonist, but I like what he was trying to do there. So that's how it answered that. That's how and why it determines it. Because you can't define those terms in terms that are simpler than themselves. You get what I'm saying? It sounds kind of complicated, but it's
yes.
just meta
Well, I
evidence.
understand what you're saying, but
Yeah, you just have to accept it.
I think I think better way of understanding these things is ultimately through well, infinite regress is something that challenges our presuppositions about
Yeah,
things.
I just
But
think that it has an explanation.
saying that it challenges those things doesn't prove the problem of infinite regress to be incorrect uh, or anything. It's kind of like you, infinite regress. I think is an actual argument, but it's it doesn't. People don't like how it feels, right? Because it's pretty much infinite regress will lead to nihilism, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think you can dispute infinite regress. So I think
But what do you mean by that?
nihilism, I think
Well,
nihilism
what do you
makes
think
more
about it? I
sense.
mean, what does it even show in the first place?
Well, if everything has a reason, right, then and you keep asking, then yeah, you're going to get on some fundamentals like physics. I think physics, to be honest, is the only thing that is really fundamental because everything is downstream from physics. So you have physics and then
But what about
um
metaphysics?
chemistry. Huh?
Metaphysics?
I don't
Are you
think
just anti?
I kind of think
You know, because
metaphysics
you
are
brought
a
up
great.
Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein actually almost rejected it in some sense.
Yes, I reject
Yeah,
metaphysics in a weird way. I think metaphysics are a good
a
way
cope.
of yeah, I think they're cope, but I also think that cope is not entirely a bad thing because ultimately under the infinite regress idea, the closest thing that you can have to a meaning to life is reproduction. And if cope helps you get into a better place where you can actually, accomplish the meaning of life, then cope might be a good thing. But that doesn't mean that cope is real. Like that doesn't mean that copes are true
Okay.
just because they help us. That's why I'm no longer a Christian, right?
Fuck. Oh, so you left it behind. Well, no, but I would say, but I do think there's an explanation for infinite regress. That's actually pretty not neat, and I think Plato was trying to get at it, but we have better arguments nowadays. So I just think that's basically proof of God. I think God's just the groundwork of being, and that he's where truth comes from. And we just probably can't comprehend all of it. So, for instance, it seems like our minds breaks down somewhat when we ask ourselves, well, how do you know that A equals A? I mean, you know about formal logic and all of that. So basically, A
Yeah.
is just anything. So A isn't, it's just a stand-in symbol for anything that exists. So if I have this
Hmm.
cup, I just randomly picked this. Most of us would presuppose that this cup is the cup. It's like a
Hmm.
linguistic property that you can't really go beyond, basically. So this
Yeah.
cup is equal to itself. And yeah, you could ask, well, how do you know that that's the case? And I think the fact that you can't really go beyond it, it just seems like we can't comprehend that it's a starting point of thought is proof that it's held up by a transcendent being. But I mean, we don't really need to go into that. So I think metaphysics is valid, but it's also what Kant was talking about too with transcendental idealism, space-time causality. He was saying we can't really be totally, it seems like they structure our existence or the preconditions of our existence. And I think that applies to many domains. But to go back to, because we're talking about well-being, morality, right? So how I think it's related is I think that's just what it boils down to. That's what, because
Yeah.
you ask why does it determine it? Because it almost has to, just by way of logical necessity, because otherwise those terms just don't even make sense. I mean, and they're human term. So they have a definition, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I
Because
think
what if you let's think
well-being
about it
and
like this. So
non-well-being do have
what if you
objective.
tried to define good and bad? I mean, how or what if we just ask people what's good and what's bad, and then we keep asking it? Like,
Yeah,
what do you think would
well,
happen?
I think what would happen is people would say, "Well, that's good or that's bad," and then they would say, "Why?" And then they would say, "Basic." They would be like basic human decency, and then why?
Yeah,
And
what I
then they
think
would
is
have no
basic.
real reason behind it
Yeah,
because
because they're NPCs and shit.
this is like liberal morality. They're like just basic human empathy, and it's like, why is basic human empathy a good thing?
I know, but what I just think that that's because they're probably sub 100 IQ and they haven't really thought about it deeply enough. But if you gave them the same argument to defend, think about like a lawyer, right? If
Hmm.
you're below a certain verbal IQ, you probably, and I'm not one of these Jared Taylor into IQ determinist type of motherfuckers, you know what I'm saying? I don't think that determines everything. Or Steve Saylor, one of those types of guys.
Yeah,
Even though I do think maybe race and IQ is, we don't need to get into that right now. It's not really
they're
relevant.
getting at something that's true.
Yeah, I think IQ is
So
important and that it's just a taboo topic because people don't like to admit that there could be these natural differences. It does,
yeah,
or differences that are at least partly natural, but I do think it explains a lot. I don't think it's a set in stone. I think you can influence it through behavior. But what I'd say is
yeah,
the brutal truth, that's also a grindcore band, but anyways, the brutal truth that people want to ignore nowadays, bro, is that honestly, there are certain professions that basically exclude people who are below a certain IQ. You can't really
yeah,
make it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's not explicitly written down, but if you're just pretty much an absolute gorilla when it comes to verbal IQ, you can't really talk or speak well, you just won't really make it in law school. I mean, the LSAT is
yeah,
literally just a test of logic and verbal reasoning. So what I would say is the people that you're thinking of are basically like those gorillas. I mean, they have the tools. They don't know. They don't even have the tools. But if you give someone the same set of assignments with better tools, with better machinery, they could provide you with a better reason or a better justification. So let's say that you ask this person, okay, why is this good? Why is this bad? And yeah, they're using that standard liberal morality, which expresses itself as, oh, we have to respect basic human empathy, bro. Just be a good person, bro. An effing good chunkin dogger and shit like that. They wouldn't go deeper than that, but doesn't mean that you can't go deeper, generally speaking. And if you took a smarter person, they'd keep drilling it down. And they'd probably just arrive at what I said, which is okay, infinite regress is solved by appeal to fundamental facts that can't be questioned. So if you keep asking, wait, why is it good? Why is it good? I would just say it just goes back to perception, to phenomenology. I think that's where it comes down to. That's what Sam Harris says. Because no, think about it like this, dude. So they say human decency, but is that really fundamental? You know what I'm saying? It's probably not fundamental for them. There's a more fundamental consideration that they're just not expressing through language. That's basically what I'm saying. I mean, but what if someone asked you what's good and what's bad, both in general
okay,
terms and with respect to specific scenarios? So almost as if it's a moral poll, basically a moral social experiment. So they give you two different scenarios, and they ask you, okay, which one's good, which one is bad, or
okay,
which one's better
yeah,
than the other. You know what I'm saying?
okay. Give me an example.
Okay, cool. Whatever. Thank you everyone for watching. Bye bye.